go to the last guy, which are carbohydrates. What should we know about carbohydrates in the cell membrane? The carbohydrates in the cell membrane, first and foremost, these guys, they form a particular layer we call glycocalyx. They form a layer we call glycocalyx. And then what is their role? The role of these guys is what I'll talk about later, but let me mention a particular stuff. These guys cannot exist alone. So unlike when I could have a lipid stand on its own, protein stand on its own, this third set of guys we call carbohydrates must be attached either to a protein or a lipid. Now, so we say they don't exist alone. So when they are attached to lipids, we call them glycolipids. When they are attached to proteins, we call them glycoproteins. So they can't exist alone, proteins or lipids. But when they're attached, we call them glycolipids, glycoproteins. Though we are told that in some cell membranes, we could have a case where, please understand that the lipid is the carbohydrate is the smaller part. Glycolipid, that means more of lipids, less of carbohydrates. But we are told there's a particular case where we could have proteoglycans, where I have more of the carbohydrate. But let's leave that. It's not our concern for today. Now, what else can I mention about carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are found only on the exterior. So I don't see carbohydrate on the internal surface of the membrane. It will only be on the external. So that's it, only on the exterior. So external surface. So I could say I can have carbohydrates. So I can have carbohydrates on lipids, I can have them on proteins. Now, what are the functions of carbohydrates in the cell membrane? Now, the main functions of carbohydrates in the cell membrane, number one is cell recognition. Now, this is very important. Cells need to know how to differentiate their cell. Oh, this is my man, this is my man. Oh, I know this cell, I know this cell. So what helps us to know cells is actually these guys we call carbohydrates. Now, for example, even when we go to immunity later, which we'll talk about, you realize that carbohydrates play a very vital role in me looking at the cell and knowing, okay, this is the normal body cell. This is the normal body. This is a normal, okay, this cell is from hepatocyte, this cell. So there's a difference, and that difference is conveyed by carbohydrates. Now, another thing is cell-to-cell adhesion. Of course, we know adhesion is when cohesive force, adhesive force in physics. Adhesion is when things are not similar, more like join. So here cells and another cell are joining together. There's a force of attraction. Now, it's called cell-to-cell adhesion. Whereby, for example, if I go to the liver, we know every tissue is made of many cells. Of course, I'm not calling the liver a tissue. But then, of course, the liver, you know what it is, an organ. But when I go to a particular tissue, there are cells. So let's say I want to look at the liver tissue, not the entire liver organ. Now, you will now be having different liver cells. So those cells have to be held together. Now, what holds them together is an attraction force, which is adhesion. And so what they use is that, more like I use the carbohydrate on my membrane, lock with your own carbohydrates. And that's what we call cell-to-cell adhesion. Now, what other function or what other role does carbohydrates serve? They also play a role in immunity. Now, this particular role is as antigens. Carbohydrates are the people that behave as antigens. So you realize, remember I told you carbohydrate don't stand alone. So of course you might hear glycoprotein, but of course it's the carbohydrate part of it that behaves as antigens. So when I go to red blood cells, for example, they have an antigen cell marking, which we'll talk about later when we do blood groups. They have a cell marking. Oh, I see A. Oh, because I saw A antigen, I know it's the person is blood group A. But the case here is that they serve a role in immunity. So those are carbohydrates. And also carbohydrate can even serve as receptors. We see this in the case of insulin. So insulin receptor is actually a carbohydrate molecule. So that covers that for the structure and function. So what did we learn today? In a sneak peek, we learned that the cell membrane is made up of proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. Now, the lipids we have in the membrane is what conveys the actual function of selective permeability that does not allow some things in but allows others in. And then you realize that when we talk about those lipids, what are they made up of? We mentioned them. You go through the class, phospholipids, cholesterol, and other lipids. We talked about their percentage. We came to proteins, integral, peripheral. Integral was my main guys. They can act as channels. They can act as carrier proteins. First of those two are transporters. Then they can act also as enzymes and then even as receptors, like in the case of G protein. Now, when we go down, we now made mention of peripheral, which can really act as enzyme but can assist the other guys in transport. We go next into carbohydrates. These ones are found only on the exterior, and then they do not exist alone. Rather, they exist in combination with lipids and proteins, and their main function is cell recognition, adhesion, and then immunity, and then we also have the save as receptors. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'll see you in our next video. We'll be learning more into other things.